Autumn 1980, Norway, and NATO flexes its military muscles. NATO troops were taking part in 25 related maneuvers right across Western Europe, involving over 250,000 men and women. All of the exercises start from the same premise, that an attack has been launched from Eastern Europe. This threat is the basic reason for NATO's existence. Over 35 years after the end of the Second World War, NATO and its East European counterpart, the Warsaw Pact, have still failed to reach any significant agreement on troop reductions and disarmament. 1980 brought fresh tensions in Europe over events in Poland and distant Afghanistan. In the aftermath of these events, the spirit of détente has taken a severe jolt. It's here in Madrid that détente is due to come under close scrutiny when leaders of East and West meet on November the 11th to resume talks on cooperation and security in Europe. The meeting in Madrid brings together the United States and the Soviet Union with all of Europe's 32 states. The other participant is Canada. The preliminary talks here have run into some problems, including the reluctance of the Soviet Union and its allies to set aside the entire pre-Christmas session to review the implementation of earlier agreements on détente. The Soviet Union does not want to hear successive Western speakers accuse East European states of continuing to violate human rights. The Finnish capital, Helsinki, gave its name to the original European agreement of 1975. The final document was hailed as a blueprint for lasting peace in Europe, and many of the world's leaders were there to endorse it. The West was enthusiastic about the Helsinki Agreement because it helps to break down still further what became known in the post-war years as the Iron Curtain, dividing Europe down the middle. The issues of human rights and freedom of expression were held by the West to be of paramount importance. The document also refers to the inviolability of existing European borders. Here, the West was conceding that there are now in effect two separate German states, a recognition Moscow and East Berlin had sought in vain for years. Political commentators were calling the final Helsinki Act a surrogate peace treaty for the Second World War. Helsinki then proved to be a triumph for talk and negotiation over aggression and conflict. East and West had both made concessions, but both sides also expected to make considerable gains. For example, in the field of science. Former Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin receives the American delegation attending a Moscow meeting of the Joint Soviet-American Commission on Science and Technology. The Commission's work was given a big boost by the Helsinki signing. Experts from both sides have pooled their resources and research findings in a number of areas, including meteorology, microbiology, geophysics, energy conservation, and protection of the environment. Another area of cooperation has been trade. The United States has long had a big wheat surplus, and Moscow was happy to buy a steady 8 million tons per year. Sales have been cut back, though, since Afghanistan. Soviet and East European-built cars have been moving in the opposite direction. They come into Western markets at competitive prices, and they are built in some cases with the help of Western know-how and even with Western-made components. Everything, however, was not going smoothly. This became abundantly clear in Belgrade at the end of 1977, when the 35 signatories of the Helsinki Act met again to review progress. The West openly accused the Russians of failing to observe the basic principle of human rights, especially in their treatment of political dissidents and Soviet Jews. After the arguing, the closing words of the American spokesman Arthur Goldberg had a hollow ring of misplaced optimism.
In the judgment of the delegation of the United States, the meeting has fulfilled its basic mandate, and although it has been difficult, it has also been successful.
So much of the discussion at the forthcoming Madrid conference will focus on human rights in the Soviet Union. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the most well-known Soviet dissident in the West. A writer, he was expelled from the Soviet Union in February 1974. Since that time, the Western media have covered his attacks on the Soviet system. Solzhenitsyn was exiled following the publication of his books in the West. But the start of the modern Soviet dissident movement goes back further than Solzhenitsyn's expulsion. It was the 1966 trial of the writers Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuri Daniel. Daniel, a Jew, had written stories mocking the docility of Russians and their obedience to all Kremlin decrees. For these bitter satires, he was sentenced to 5 years in jails and camps. A fellow dissident now living in Britain, Vladimir Bukovsky, spent half his adult life in Soviet prisons and labor camps. He describes conditions.
Well, the worst of them is the prison, of course, because you are isolated for the whole time you're serving in it, under the lock 24 hours, and so many restrictions, no visits of relatives, of anybody. Well, and you're permitted to write 1 letter a month, or even in a strict regime, 1 letter in 2 months. And the food is abridged, and rations are very scanty, and you know, a lot of things like it. Very hard time, especially in Vladimir prison.
What about the labor camp? How does that compare?
Well, it's slightly better than in Vladimir prison, as in prison, because you are permitted to go inside of the camp. You could spend time not indoor, but outdoor, outside of the door. You can see.
In London in May 1978, Russian dissidents gathered to present the case of Professor Yuri Orlov, a prominent physicist. He was on trial in Moscow for slandering the Soviet state.
He is a fellow physicist. Ludmila Alexeyeva, who is a close personal friend of Yuri Orlov, and it would be difficult, ladies and gentlemen, to exaggerate the importance in the terms of East-West relations of the trial of Yuri Orlov, which is taking place in Moscow today.
This London meeting tried to present Orlov's defense. In the Soviet Union, organizing a defense case for dissidents is very difficult. It is considered anti-constitutional to defend political prisoners. Orlov had been a member of a group set up to monitor Russian adherence to the Helsinki Accord. For this activity, he became the first member of the Academy of Soviet Scientists to be imprisoned since the Stalin era.
И Орлов, как руководитель группы, всегда строго следил за том, чтобы наши...
The difficulties of defending dissidents are illustrated by this film taken outside a Moscow courtroom in July 1978. The mother of dissident Anatoly Sharansky and her friends were barred by KGB agents from entering the courtroom where her son was being tried. Sharansky, a 31-year-old computer programmer, was one of the most effective members of the Helsinki Human Rights Monitoring Group in Moscow. He was sentenced to 13 years imprisonment. May 1979. 5 dissidents were put on a plane to the West in exchange for 2 KGB spies held in America. Mark Dimsheets was a former Soviet Air Force pilot. After being denied emigration to Israel, he and 10 others tried to hijack a plane. Eduard Kuznetsov had participated in the abortive hijacking and received a 15-year sentence. He had been a Jewish activist for many years. The human swap took place against the background of President Carter's human rights policy. The Carter administration pointed to the deal as a successful illustration of that initiative. However, in recent months, the human rights campaign has assumed a low priority for the American government. Dissidents and their friends have argued that the Western response to recent crackdowns on human rights campaigners in Russia has been weak. Prior to this year's Olympic Games, the Russian authorities ordered a cleanup of dissidents. At a press conference in Italy before the Olympics, Vladimir Bukovsky saw a boycott of the Games as essential to stop the Soviet crackdown. A boycott disrupting the Games was the best way the West could put pressure on the Soviet authorities. The pre-Olympic smothering of dissent was more extensive than previous drives by the KGB.
For the last several months, more than 200 people had been arrested. All of them are the most active members of the human rights movement in Soviet Union, both in national movement and religious movement and in all other branches of it.
One of the most celebrated dissidents affected by the crackdown was Dr. Andrei Sakharov. The famous Nobel Prize-winning scientist had for many years been a focus of human rights dissent in Russia. His Moscow flat was a meeting place for Western journalists and sympathizers. Sakharov's position as one of Russia's leading scientists had shielded him from the fate of other human rights, religious and minority dissidents. But in January 1980, 6 months before the Olympics, the Soviet authorities ordered his banishment to the industrial city of Gorky. Sakharov was, however, still able to give this interview to an American television network. He called for increased pressure on the Soviet government on human rights issues before the Madrid conference.
Isn't it conceivable that Washington could push too hard? I believe that the irritation of official Soviet circles is connected with the fact they recognize the weakness of their position. These are critical times which will determine the style of international relations, détente, the future of our planet, and at the same time, the personal fate of dissidents in the USSR and Eastern Europe who are experiencing the frontal blow of repression. To pay less attention now to the problem of human rights under current conditions would have tragic consequences.
But the Soviet Union says these scenes in Miami, Florida, show the reverse side of the coin.
Go back to Georgia, you peanut butter! Go back to Georgia!
Jimmy Carter is the target of the black demonstrators who claim that Carter's preoccupation with human rights in other countries has led to the neglect of the welfare of minorities within the United States. The aftermath of the Miami riots, the arson and looting, are held up by the Eastern Bloc as evidence of racism and neglect. Charges which Washington, of course, strongly denies.
Why can't we show him?
Outright cheating.
The Soviets and their allies also point to events in Britain's trouble spot, Northern Ireland. They say armed troops on the streets are a bad advertisement for democracy and human rights. They point to charges against Britain by detainees of inhuman treatment in Northern Ireland jails, charges upheld by an international court. The British say the troops are here to protect local citizens against terrorists. Pictures of Belfast streets in 1980 will continue to give the Soviets ammunition in Madrid. The mountains of Afghanistan, a remote country, but now a topic that is expected to be high on the agenda at the Madrid conference. That is, if the West gets its way. As 1980 began, Soviet armor was rolling into Afghanistan to support the new communist regime of Babrak Kemal. Western countries saw the move as a violation of one of the basic principles of the Helsinki Agreement, non-interference in the affairs of neighboring states. Moscow insisted its troops were invited in merely to help a friendly government. One of the immediate casualties of Afghanistan was the Moscow Olympics. The United States led a partially successful boycott of the Games, and teams of athletes who did go to Moscow carried out their own symbolic protests. In retrospect, though, it was the Olympic ideal which suffered just as much as international relations. The Polish city of Gdansk followed the Olympic Games as the next source of East-West tension. The Lenin shipyard workers launched a determined strike and occupation, which eventually won them the right to form their own trade unions. They were also concerned with other basic rights, and one of their demands was the publication in full of the Helsinki Agreement documents. It raised new tensions in the Eastern Bloc, even though the United States and the Soviet Union reached a tacit agreement not to intervene directly. A related issue, which could be raised in Madrid, concerns freedom of information across borders. During the Polish troubles, Western radio stations noticed that their broadcasts to Eastern Europe were being distorted. It appeared to be a blatant example of radio jamming, which had been a feature of the Cold War. Moscow denied the charge of jamming, and so at least the principle of free information remains. The agreement covers television and newspapers as well as radio, and is regarded by many as one of the most satisfying concrete results of recent years. Every year, on the anniversary of its revolution, the Soviet Union parades its military might through Red Square. President Brezhnev has given his name to the Brezhnev Doctrine, under which Moscow says it will send its forces to assist any of its allies that asks for help. Soviet-built tanks, here on Warsaw Pact maneuvers, are part of the military hardware ready to act out the Brezhnev Doctrine. A possible reduction in Warsaw Pact and NATO forces could be discussed in Madrid on the initiative of the Eastern Bloc. However, previous East-West talks on troops and arms reductions have achieved very few positive results. The United States continues to send large numbers of its troops into Western Europe, here to an Air Force base in West Germany, because the Americans are traditionally distrustful of Soviet intentions. Long, drawn-out negotiations between Washington and Moscow on arms and troop reductions have been remarkable only by their lack of success. East European moves to discuss reductions within the framework of the Helsinki Agreement have been greeted with extreme caution in Washington. Caution reflected by the hundreds of American phantoms that remain on constant alert in Europe. Peaceful landscape in West Germany. But it's over terrain like this that any future ground war in Europe is likely to be fought. The peace is often shattered by heavy armament. NATO's basic strategy, which it has operated for over 30 years, is founded not on starting a war, but on deterring it. Heavy armor and air support are the first stage. The next stage is the realm of thinking the unthinkable, the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and then the long-range nuclear weapons targeted on the enemy's homeland. So though NATO exercises are often an intrusion, they are recognized in the West European capitals as essential in order to maintain a credible deterrent. As long as the Warsaw Pact forces remain numerically strong and up to date, NATO is determined to match them. It's against this background that any kind of progress at Madrid will have to take place. Europeans especially fear the possibility of escalation from conventional warfare to nuclear conflict. As weapons grow in sophistication, it could now be possible to have a limited nuclear war with Europe as the battlefield. A major source of dissent among NATO countries concerns the American cruise missile. It represents a big advance in nuclear weaponry. Basically, it's a flying bomb with a nuclear warhead, and because of its simplicity, it costs only 1/30th of a modern jet fighter. It can be launched from the ground, from underwater, or from the air. Under American prompting, NATO command decided to deploy 464 of these missiles around bases in 5 member states: Britain, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, and Holland. But internal political pressures have meant that the Dutch and Belgians still have not committed themselves to accepting the cruise missiles, as agreed at the NATO meeting of December 1979. And among the socialist parties of the European community, only the West Germans and Italians support the deployment of the cruise missile. The introduction of cruise missiles, planned for 1983, was in part NATO's response to the deployment of over 150 Soviet SS-20 nuclear missiles targeted on Western Europe. It can be seen as just another step in the arms race. But NATO has announced its decision to deploy cruise missiles some 3 years in advance, and that may mean the issue could be negotiable. In August 1980, Washington and Moscow agreed to begin talks on the missiles issue. The reason why such talks might succeed, and why further talks may emerge from the Madrid conference, is the threat the missiles represent, their sheer destructive power, which can be delivered from a range of 2,000 kilometers. Nuclear warfare would look something like this. A symbol of the post-war division of Europe is the city of Berlin, which is one of the major crossing points between East and West. As such, the West Berlin government has been leading the protests against East Germany's decision in October to more than double the amount of money Western visitors are obliged to change into East German marks. The East Berlin government has also demanded that West Germany should recognize a distinct East German citizenship, and that ambassadors should replace the special representatives now representing the 2 states. These moves have always been resisted in Bonn in order not to prejudice any future German reunification. The timing of East Germany's decisions is almost certainly deliberate, coming less than a month before the opening of the Madrid conference. It could indicate a hardening of attitudes by the whole Eastern Bloc, a warning that the steady progress of détente can be halted or made conditional on more concessions by the West. Military exercises and political maneuvering together make a rather gloomy background for the Madrid meeting. East and West Europe are heavily armed, but all the signatories to the Helsinki Final Act are at the same time committed to détente. One paragraph of the document says prior notification must be given by either side of any exercise like this one, and military observers must also be exchanged. It's part of what's called the basket of confidence-building measures, ways to lessen military tension. It, at least, is proving successful. Other baskets deal with economic and scientific cooperation and with human rights, information and culture. The 4th basket contains resolutions on how to follow up the Helsinki Agreement, and 2 of them refer specifically to disarmament. France, which is not an active NATO member, wants a general conference on disarmament in Europe, while the Russians would call theirs a conference on military détente and disarmament. The West would prefer more progress on human rights, including the treatment of dissidents. It is wary of a separate conference on military issues, insisting that political and military détente are indivisible. It also suspects that Soviet-inspired talks would be aimed at preventing the deployment of more Western nuclear weapons. Even so, there's evidence the impetus exists for more serious talks on troop and arms reductions. And that could make any agreement reached in Madrid as important historically as the 1975 Helsinki Act.